This episode of the Haunting You podcast is brought to you by VFX. Scare, entertain, and promote with VFX products. Learn more at vfxcreates.com.
Happy Halloween!
Coming to you live from the Chamber of Haunters Studios. This is Haunting You, and I would like to welcome you as your host, Leslie Reed, to our 4th annual special Campfire Stories Halloween episode.
Abso-freaking-lutely. This is Keoni Hutton. Happy Halloween, everyone. I am so excited to be here with you. And thank you for taking time out of your, I'm sure, very busy Halloween to come and spend a few minutes with us to hear us tell some of our favorite spooky stories here live on the podcast. This is our 4th installment. So if you want to hear more spooky stories read by your favorite Haunting You hosts, definitely go check out Campfire Stories 1, 2, and 3 that you can find released on Halloween over the last 3 years. But we're not going to waste time with anything else. This episode is all about celebrating horror and creepiness and just all of the things that these genres do so well and imprint on our lives, and we want to share with you. So Leslie, let's kick it over to you to kick us off.
Alrighty. For the first of my stories, I am going to read The Black Cat by Edgar Allan Poe. This may be known to some of you through the Netflix show Wednesday, because that is the name of the boat that they race and win. I would like to add a significant trigger warning of severe cruelty to animals. So, if that is something that bothers you, please skip this story. Alrighty, and now, without further ado, The Black Cat by Edgar Allan Poe. For the most wild, yet most homely narrative which I am about to pen, I neither expect nor solicit belief. Mad indeed would I be to expect it, in a case where my very senses reject their own evidence. Yet, mad am I not, and very surely do I not dream. But tomorrow, I die, and today, I would unburden my soul. My immediate purpose is to place before the world, plainly, succinctly, and without comment, a series of mere household events. In their consequences, these events have terrified, have tortured, have destroyed me. Yet, I will not attempt to expound them. To me, they have presented little but horror. To many, they will seem less terrible than Baroque's. Hereafter, perhaps, some intellect may be found which will reduce my phantasm to the commonplace. Some intellect more calm, more logical, and far less excitable than my own, which will perceive, in the circumstances I detail with awe, nothing more than an ordinary succession of very natural causes and effects. From my infancy, I was noted for the docility and humanity of my disposition. My tenderness of heart was even so conspicuous as to make me the jest of my companions. I was especially fond of animals, and was indulged by my parents with a great variety of pets. With these, I spent most of my time, and never was so happy as when feeding and caressing them. This peculiarity of character grew with my growth, and in my manhood I derived from it one of my principal sources of pleasure. To those who have cherished an affection for a faithful and sagacious dog, I need hardly be at the trouble of explaining the nature or the intensity of the gratification thus derivable. There is something in the unselfish and self-sacrificing love of a brute which goes directly to the heart of him who has had frequent occasion to test the paltry friendship and gossamer fidelity of a mere man. I married early, and was happy to find in my wife a disposition not uncongenial with my own. Observing my partiality for domestic pets, she lost no opportunity in procuring those of the most agreeable kind. We had birds, goldfish, a fine dog, rabbits, a small monkey, and a cat. This latter was a remarkably large and beautiful animal, entirely black and sagacious to an astonishing degree. In speaking of his intelligence, my wife, who at heart was not a little tinctured with superstition, made frequent allusion to the ancient popular notion, which regarded all black cats as witches in disguise. Not that she was ever serious upon this point. I mention the matter at all for no better reason than that it happens, just now, to be remembered. Pluto, this was the cat's name, was my favorite pet and playmate. I alone fed him, and he attended me wherever I went about the house. It was even with difficulty that I could prevent him from following me through the streets. Our friendship lasted in this manner for several years, during which my general temperament and character, through the instrumentality of the fiend intemperance, had, I blush to confess it, experienced a radical alteration for the worse. I grew, day by day, more moody, more irritable, and more regardless of the feelings of others. I suffered myself to use intemperate language to my wife. At length, I even offered her personal violence. My pets, of course, were made to feel the change in my disposition. I not only neglected, but ill-used them. For Pluto, however, I still retained sufficient regard to restrain me from maltreating him, as I made no scruple of maltreating the rabbits, the monkey, or even the dog, when by accident or through affection they came in my way. But my disease grew upon me. For what disease is like? Alcohol. And at length, even Pluto, who was now becoming old and consequently somewhat peevish, even Pluto began to experience the effects of my ill temper. One night, returning home, much intoxicated, from one of my haunts about town, I fancied that the cat avoided my presence. I seized him, when in his fright at my violence, he inflicted a slight wound upon my hand with his teeth. The fury of a demon instantly possessed me. I knew myself no longer. My original soul seemed at once to take flight from my body, and a more than fiendish malevolence, gin-nurtured, thrilled every fibre of my frame. I took from my waistcoat pocket a penknife, opened it, grasped the poor beast by the throat, and deliberately cut one of its eyes from the socket. I blush, I burn, I shudder, while I pen the damnable atrocity. When reason returned with the morning, when I had slept off the fumes of the night's debauch, I experienced a sentiment of half of horror, half of remorse, for the crime of which I had been guilty. But it was, at best, a feeble and equivocal feeling, and the soul remained untouched. I again plunged into excess, and soon drowned in wine all memory of the deed. In the meantime, the cat slowly recovered. The socket of the lost eye presented, it is true, a frightful appearance, but he no longer appeared to suffer any pain. He went about the house as usual, but as might be expected, he fled in extreme terror at my approach. I had so much of my old heart left as to be at first grieved by this evident dislike on the part of a creature which had once so loved me, but this feeling soon gave place to irritation, and then came, as if to my final and irrevocable overthrow, the spirit of perverseness. Of this spirit philosophy takes no account. Yet I am not more sure that my soul lives than I am that perverseness is one of the primitive impulses of the human heart, one of the indivisible primary faculties or sentiments which give direction to the character of man. Who has not 100 times found himself committing a vile or stupid action for no other reason than because he knows he should not? Have we not a perpetual inclination, in the teeth of our best judgment, to violate that which is law, merely because we understand it to be such? This spirit of perverseness, I say, came to my final overthrow. It was this unfathomable longing of the soul to vex itself, to offer violence to its own nature, to do wrong for the wrong's sake only, that urged me to continue, and finally to consummate the injury I had inflicted upon the unoffending brute. One morning, in cold blood, I slipped a noose about its neck and hung it to the limb of a tree. Hung it with tears streaming from my eyes and with the bitterest remorse at my heart. Hung it because I knew that it had loved me, and because I felt it had given me no reason for offense. I hung it because I knew that in doing so, I was committing a sin, a deadly sin that would so jeopardize my immortal soul as to place it, if such a thing were possible, even beyond the reach of the infinite mercy of the most merciful and most terrible God. On the night of the day on which this most cruel deed was done, I was aroused from sleep by the cry of fire. The curtains of my bed were in flames. The whole house was blazing. It was with great difficulty that my wife, a servant, and myself made our escape from the conflagration. The destruction was complete. My entire worldly wealth was swallowed up, and I resigned myself thenceforward to despair. I am above the weakness of seeking to establish a sequence of cause and effect between the disaster and the atrocity, but I am detailing a chain of facts, and wish not to leave even a possible link imperfect. On the day succeeding the fire, I visited the ruins. The walls, with one exception, had fallen in. This exception was found in a compartment wall, not very thick, which stood about the middle of the house, and against which had rested the head of my bed. The plastering had here, in great measure, resisted the action of the fire, a fact which I attributed to its have been recently spread. About this wall a dense crowd were collected, and many persons seemed to be examining a particular portion of it with very minute and eager attention. The words strange, singular, and other similar expressions excited my curiosity. I approached and saw, as if graven in bas relief upon the white surface, the figure of a gigantic cat. The impression was given with the accuracy truly marvelous. There was a rope about the animal's neck. When I first beheld this apparition, for I could scarcely regard it as less, my wonder and my terror were extreme. But at length reflection came to my aid. The cat, I remembered, had been hung in a garden adjacent to the house. Upon the alarm of fire, this garden had been immediately filled by the crowd, by someone of whom the animal must have been cut from the tree and thrown, through an open window, into my chamber. This had probably been done with the view of arousing me from sleep. The falling of other walls had compressed the victim of my cruelty into the substance of the freshly spread plaster, the lime of which, with the flames and with the ammonia from the carcass, had then accomplished the portraiture as I saw it. Although I thus readily accounted to my reason, if not altogether to my conscience, for the startling fact just detailed, it did not the less fail to make a deep impression upon my fancy. For months I could not rid myself of the phantasm of the cat, and, during this period, there came back into my spirit a half-sentiment that seemed but was not remorse. I went so far as to regret the loss of the animal, and had to look about me among the vile haunts which I now habitually frequented for another pet of the same species and of somewhat similar appearance with which to supply its place. One night, as I sat, half stupefied, in a den of more than infamy, my attention was suddenly drawn to some black object reposing upon the head of one of the immense hogsheads of gin or rum which constituted the chief furniture of the apartment. I had been looking steadily at the top of this hogshead for some minutes, and what now caused me surprise was the fact that I had not sooner perceived the object thereupon. I approached it and touched it with my hand. It was a black cat, a very large one, fully as large as Pluto, and closely resembling him in every respect but one. Pluto had not a white hair upon any portion of his body, but this cat had a large, although indefinite splotch of white, covering nearly the whole region of the breast. Upon my touching him, he immediately arose, purred loudly, rubbed against my hand, and appeared delighted with my notice. This, then, was the very creature of which I was in search. I at once offered to purchase it of the landlord, but this person made no claim to it, knew nothing of it, had never seen it before. I continued my caresses, and when I prepared to go home, the animal evinced a disposition to accompany me. I permitted it to do so, occasionally stooping and patting it as I proceeded. When it reached the house, it domesticated itself at once, and became immediately a great favorite with my wife. For my own part, I soon found a dislike to it arising within me. This was just the reverse of what I had anticipated, but I know not how or why it was. Its evident fondness for myself rather disgusted and annoyed me. By slow degrees, these feelings of disgust and annoyance arose into bitterness of hatred. I avoided the creature, a certain sense of shame, and the remembrance of my former deed of cruelty, preventing me from physically abusing it. I did not, for some weeks, strike or otherwise violently ill-use it, but gradually, very gradually, I came to look upon it with unutterable loathing, and to flee silently from its odious presence as from the breath of a pestilence. What added, no doubt, to my hatred of the beast was the discovery, on the morning after I brought it home, that, like Pluto, it also had been deprived of one of its eyes. This circumstance, however, only endeared it to my wife, who, as I have already said, possessed in a high degree that humanity of feeling which had once been my distinguishing trait, and the source of many of my simplest and purest pleasures. With my aversion to this cat, however, its partiality for myself seemed to increase. It followed my footsteps with a pertinacity which it would be difficult to make the reader comprehend. When I sat, it would crouch beneath my chair or spring upon my knees, covering me with its loathsome caresses. If I arose to walk it, it would get up between my feet and thus nearly throw me down, or fastening its long, sharp claws in this manner to my breast. At such times, although I longed to destroy it with a blow, I was yet withheld from doing so, partly by a memory of my former crime, but chiefly, let me confess it at once, by absolute dread of the beast. This dread was not exactly a dread of physical evil, and yet I should be at loss how otherwise to define it. I'm almost ashamed to own, yes, even in this felon's cell, I am almost ashamed to own that the terror and horror with which the animal inspired me had been heightened by one of the merest chimeras it would be possible to conceive. My wife had called my attention, more than once, to the character of the mark of white hair of which I have spoken, and which constituted the sole visible difference between the strange beast and the one I had destroyed. The reader will remember that this mark, although large, had been originally very indefinite, but by slow degrees nearly imperceptible, and which for a long time my reason struggled to reject as fanciful, it had at length assumed a rigorous distinctness of outline. It was now the representation of an object that I shudder to name, and for this, above all, I loathed and dreaded, and would have rid myself of the monster had I dared. It was now, I say, the image of a ghastly thing, of the gallows. O mournful and terrible engine of horror and of crime, of agony and of death. And now I was indeed wretched beyond the wretchedness of mere humanity, and a brute beast, whose fellow I had contemptuously destroyed, a brute beast, to work out for me, a man fashioned in the image of the high God, so much of insufferable woe. Alas, neither by day nor by night knew I the blessing of rest any more. During the former, the creature left me no moment alone, and in the latter, I started hourly from dreams of unutterable fear to find the hot breath of the thing upon my face, and its vast weight, an incarnate nightmare that I had no power to shake off, incumbent eternally upon my heart. Beneath the pressure of torments, such as these, the feeble remnant of the good within me succumbed. Evil thoughts became my sole intimates, the darkest and most evil of thoughts. The moodiness of my usual temper increased to hatred of all things and of all mankind, while from the sudden, frequent, and ungovernable outbursts of a fury to which I now blindly abandoned myself, my uncomplaining wife, alas, was the most usual and the most patient of sufferers. One day she accompanied me, upon some household errand, into the cellar of the old building which our poverty compelled us to inhabit. The cat followed me down the steep stairs, and nearly throwing me headlong, exasperated me to madness. Uplifting an axe, and forgetting in my wrath the childish dread which had hitherto stayed my hand, I aimed a blow at the animal, which of course would have proved instantly fatal, have it descended as I wished. But this blow was arrested by the hand of my wife. Goaded by the interference into a rage more than demoniacal, I withdrew my arm from her grasp and buried the axe in her brain. She fell dead upon the spot without a groan. This hideous murder accomplished, I set myself forthwith, with entire deliberation, to the task of concealing the body. I knew that I could not remove it from the house, either by day or by night, without the risk of being observed by the neighbors. Many projects entered my mind. At one period I thought of cutting the corpse into minute fragments and destroying them by fire. At another I resolved to dig a grave for it in the floor of the cellar. Again I deliberated about casting it in the well in the yard, about packing it in a box, as if merchandise, with the usual arrangements, and so getting a porter to take it from the house. Finally, I hit upon what I considered a far better expedient than either of these. I determined to wall it up in the cellar, as the monks of the Middle Ages are recorded to have walled up their victims. For a purpose such as this, the cellar was well adapted. Its walls were loosely constructed, and had lately been plastered throughout with a rough plaster which the dampness of the atmosphere had prevented from hardening. Moreover, in one of the walls was a projection, caused by a false chimney or fireplace that had been filled up and made to resemble the rest of the cellar. I made no doubt that I could readily displace the bricks at this point, insert the corpse, and wall the whole up as before, so that no eye could detect anything suspicious. And in this calculation I was not deceived. By means of a crowbar, I easily dislodged the bricks, and having carefully deposited the body against the inner wall, I propped it in that position, while with little trouble I relaid the whole structure as it originally stood. Having procured mortar, sand, and hair, with every possible precaution, I prepared a plaster which could not be distinguished from the old, and with this I very carefully went over the new brickwork. When I had finished, I felt satisfied that all was right. The wall did not present the slightest appearance of having been disturbed. The rubbish on the floor was picked up with the minutest care. I looked around triumphantly and said to myself, "Here at least, then, my labor has not been in vain." My next step was to look for the beast which had been the cause of so much wretchedness, for I had, at length, firmly resolved to put it to death. Had I been able to meet with it at the moment, there could have been no doubt of its fate. But it appeared that the crafty animal had been alarmed at the violence of my previous anger, and forbore to present itself in my present mood. It is impossible to describe or to imagine the deep and blissful sense of relief which the absence of the detested creature occasioned in my bosom. It did not make its appearance during the night, and thus, for one night at least, since its introduction into the house, I have soundly and tranquilly slept. I slept, even with the burden of murder upon my soul. The second and the third day passed, and still my tormentor came not. Once again I breathed as a free man. The monster, in terror, had fled the premises for ever. I should behold it no more. My happiness was supreme. The guilt of my dark deed disturbed me but little. Some few inquiries had been made, but these had been readily answered. Even a search had been instituted, but of course nothing was to be discovered. I looked upon my future felicity as secured. Upon the fourth day of the assassination, a party of the police came very unexpectedly into the house, and proceeded again to make rigorous investigation of the premises. Secure, however, in the inscrutability of my place of concealment, I felt no embarrassment whatsoever. The officers bade me to accompany them in their search. They left no nook or corner unexplored. At length, for the third or fourth time, they descended into the cellar. I quivered not in a muscle. My heart beat calmly as that of one who slumbers in innocence. I walked the cellar from end to end. I folded my arms upon my bosom and roamed easily to and fro. The police were thoroughly satisfied and prepared to depart. The glee at my heart was too strong to be restrained. I burned to say as if but one word by way of triumph, and to render doubly sure their assurance of my guiltlessness. "Gentlemen," I said at last, as the party ascended the steps, "I delight to have allayed your suspicions. I wish you all health and a little more courtesy. By the by, gentlemen, this is a very well-constructed house." In the rabid desire to say something easily, I scarcely knew what I uttered at all. I may say an excellently well-constructed house. These walls— Are you going, gentlemen? These walls are solidly put together. And here, through the mere frenzy of bravado, I rapped heavily with a cane, in which I held in my hand upon the very portion of the brickwork behind which stood the corpse of my wife of my bosom. But may God shield and deliver me from the fangs of the arch-fiend. No sooner had the reverberation of my blows sunk into silence than I was answered by a voice from within the tomb, by a cry, at first muffled and broken, like the sobbing of a child, and then quickly swelling into one long, loud, and continuous scream, utterly anomalous and inhuman, a howl, a wailing shriek, half of horror and half of triumph, such as might have arisen only out of hell, conjointly from the throats of the damned in their agony, and of the demons that exult in the damnation. Of my own thoughts, it is folly to speak. Swooning, I staggered to the opposite wall. For one instant, the party on the stairs remained motionless, through extremity of terror. For one instant, the party on the stairs remained motionless, through extremity of terror and awe. In the next, a dozen stout arms were toiling at the wall. It fell bodily. The corpse, already greatly decayed and clotted with gore, stood erect before the eyes of the spectators. Upon its head, with red extended mouth and solitary eye of fire, sat the hideous beast whose craft had seduced me into murder, and whose informing voice had consigned me to the hangman. I had walled the monster up within the tomb.
For my first story tonight, I've chosen Witchwork by Neil Gaiman. And I just want to read this little bit that Gaiman says about this poem. Quote, "I wanted to write something that seemed to be about the person it was about, while it was actually about the person telling it. I wanted something that felt like a nursery rhyme and which echoed. In my head, this is probably a Dunsany story I never actually wrote." The witch was as old as the mulberry tree. She lived in the house of 100 clocks. She sold storms and sorrows and calmed the sea, and she kept her life in a box. The tree was the oldest that I'd ever seen. Its trunk flowed like liquid. It dripped with age. But every September, its fruit stained the green, as scarlet as harlots, as red as my rage. The clocks whispered time, which they caught in their gears. They crept and they chattered. They chimed and they chewed. She fed them on minutes. The old ones ate years. She feared and she loved them, her wild clocky brood. She sold me a storm when my anger was strong, and my hate filled the world with volcanoes and laughter. I watched as the lightnings and wind sang their song, and my madness was swallowed by what happened after. She sold me 3 sorrows, all wrapped in a cloth. The first one I gave to my enemy's child. The second my woman made into a broth. The third waits unused, for we reconciled. She sold calm seas to the mariners' wives, bound the winds with silk cords so the storms could be tied there. The women at home lived much happier lives till their husbands returned and their patience be tried there. The witch hid her life in a box made of dirt, as big as a fist and as dark as a heart. There was nothing but time there, and silence and hurt, while the witch watched the waves with her pain and her art. But he never came back. He never came back. The witch was as old as the mulberry tree. She lived in the house of 100 clocks. She sold storms and sorrows and calmed the sea, and she kept her life in a box.
So I'm going to be reading, of course, as is tradition at this point, a Batman story. A selected passage from a Batman book that I was lucky enough to find on Amazon. It's called Batman, Scary Stories for a Dark Night. And this is by Matt Cody, illustrated by Jeanette Arroyo. This is a short story called Something to Fear. Dr. Jonathan Crane gazed into the multifaceted jewel pendant, and he didn't like what he saw. He'd never been a fan of his own face. Too long by the standards of modern beauty, and a hawk nose. Watching his fractured features stare back at him now only compounded his displeasure. Dr. Crane's slender fingers found the burlap mask on his desk and pulled it on. Now, when he looked at his reflection of the jewel, he saw jaggedly cut eye holders and a stitched grin. The mask fastened at the neck with a loop of twine, like a hangman's noose. His true face, the face of the Scarecrow. What was it that Tetch had said about his precious jewel? That it made dreams into reality? What a fool. Jervis Tetch had once been a man of science, like the Scarecrow, but he'd lost himself in a ridiculous children's story. The Scarecrow was a scientist of fear. His life's work was the study of it on a biological level. The instantaneous chemical reactions simulated by outside stimuli that could drive a person mad. The Scarecrow perfected fear in its weaponized form, a simple gas that triggered delusions drawn from a person's deepest horrors. So, in a sense, the Scarecrow was like Tetch's jewel, that it made him smile. I will make your dreams come true. Only they won't be good ones. It was still a mystery why Jervis had suddenly abandoned his hideout or why he'd gone shrieking into the streets. But when word got back to the Scarecrow, he'd been quick to act. He raided Tetch's haberdashery with the hope of finding cash or maybe even some of Jervis's admittedly rather brilliant hypnotizing technology. But to his surprise, he found the jewel, the famed Blackfire pendant, lying there on the floor, the same jewel they'd fought over earlier that very evening. The pendant would fetch the Scarecrow a small fortune on the black market. Superstitious fools would pay millions for it. The Scarecrow pulled his gaze away from the jewel and looked out the window. The bat signal lit up the sky tonight. That meant he would need to lie low. Time and time again, the master of fear had his plans foiled by Gotham City's dark night. The Scarecrow glanced back at the jewel. Could Batman ruin his plans to sell the pendant? After all he'd gone through, the thought of it ending up in the hands of the Caped Crusader made his normally cold blood boil. Alas, tonight, the jewel was his. But it would be best to get out of town for a while. Jervis Tetch's henchmen might want a little payback of their own. And now with the bat signal in the sky, the Scarecrow would lie low until the heat died down. Yes, that is what he'd do. He had recently acquired a new base of operations, but it wasn't very secure. Up until recently, the warehouse at Pier 66 had belonged to the ventriloquist, the rumors swirling around his latest arrest. Ghosts and possessions, a haunted doll, made it the perfect fit for Scarecrow and his gang. The Scarecrow was a sucker for a good ghost story. He'd moved in with his quote-unquote ravens. That's what he called them, the dim-witted henchmen who worked for him. A few of them complained about the Raven mask, but the Scarecrow told them if they didn't like it, they could go work for the Joker. See how they liked robbing banks in clown shoes. So, it was time to say an early goodbye to their new home. The Scarecrow needed to pack his precious chemical lab and his reserves of fear gas. That was always tricky business, because the leaky canister could send his men into hysterics. Better tell one of the Ravens to break out the gas mask. He holstered his fear gas canister in his side and draped the jeweled pendant around his neck. Time to go. But when he opened the door, the guards were not there. There were supposed to be 2 ravens stationed outside the door at all times. No sleeping on duty. Tonight's shift would have been Knuckles and Bugsy. The Scarecrow had made a schedule himself. You can't get good help these days, he muttered. Maybe a night in a locked room with a dose of the fear gas will teach them. The Scarecrow's lab was on the ground floor, and his office, or as he preferred to call it, his inner sanctum, was on the 5th floor. So, he walked down the long hall to the maintenance elevator, where there would be ravens on each floor, and he could have just taken the stairs down one flight to find someone. But steps were harder than you might imagine. But the steps were harder than you might think for a man with a burlap sack mask over his face. The elevator creaked and groaned as it arrived. When the cage doors opened, the Scarecrow rehearsed what he'd say to his ravens, but what he saw inside stopped him in his tracks. He found Knuckles and Bugsy all right. They were tied up and unconscious, slumped back to back on the elevator floor. A single bat-shaped boomerang was tucked into Bugsy's shirt pocket like a calling card. Batman, muttered the Scarecrow, his voice echoing through the warehouse. No need to be subtle now. But no one raised an alarm. The Scarecrow waited for the sound of footsteps running to his rescue, but all he heard was silence. What if there was no one to raise an alarm? What if the ravens had flown the coop? What if Batman had gotten them all? Scarecrow whirled around at the sound of his name and drew upon his gas sprayer, ready to use it. Batman was there, standing in the shadows at the end of the hall. The Scarecrow could see the distinct silhouette. "Curse you, Batman!" cried the Scarecrow. He had found him. He always found him. Batman said his name again, only instead of his usual throaty growl, his voice gurgled and rasped. Scarecrow. It didn't sound like Batman at all. Was this some sort of trick? Some revenge of Jervis touches? Whoever it was, they were about to experience their deepest fears for their insolence. The Scarecrow fired his gas spray, filling up the hallway with the terror-tinged fog. He waited for the horrified screams, but they never came. Instead, he heard shuffling. Scarecrow. Batman emerged from the cloud of gas. His cape was ragged and torn and caked with mud. He looked like something from a horror movie, or worse yet, thought the Scarecrow, one of my own nightmares. Scarecrow. The Scarecrow observed his own reaction critically. He was a man of science after all. His heartbeat accelerated. He began to perspire heavily. His mouth tasted metallic, like copper. His adrenaline fueled his fight-or-flight response. The villain backed into the elevator and hit the button to close the doors, while the shambling Batman continued coming closer and closer. The Scarecrow hit the button again, and again, and again, and again, but nothing happened. Batman reached for him. The doors finally shut, but they couldn't close all the way. Bony fingers wriggled at him through the door. With a cry, the Scarecrow smashed his gas sprayer into the fingers, and they broke like dusty twigs. With a heave, the elevator began to move. The Scarecrow allowed himself to take a breath, but the freight elevator was ponderously slow, and he squeezed himself up against the corner, as far away from the wriggling fingers as he could get. 3rd floor, 2nd floor, 1st. Suddenly, there was a heavy thump on the ceiling above him. Something had hit the roof of the elevator, followed by a dragging sound. He's on the ceiling. He dropped down the elevator shaft. The ground floor of the warehouse was a dark maze of crates that now stood between the Scarecrow and his freedom. Plenty of places for Batman to attack him. But what other choice did the Scarecrow have at this point? As he hurried through the warehouse, he listened for the slightest sound. He peeked around every corner. He'd made it more than halfway across the room. Still no bat. All he heard was quiet. Unsettling, deep quiet. And there, up ahead, was the exit. He could see the sign's dull red glow. Almost seemed too good to be true. Then a shadow stepped out. The familiar bat cape and cowl blocked the light of the exit sign. The Scarecrow fell to his knees. He was finished. Even in death, apparently, Batman had won. "Get down and close your eyes," the Scarecrow obeyed. Something flashed brightly, and the Scarecrow's vision turned red. even when his eyes were shut tight and the wave of heat struck his back. Scarecrow. He heard the gurgling call of his name, but it was behind him. Turning, the Scarecrow dared to open his eyes. The bat-like thing was standing there now, mere feet away, the source of the blinding light. The flash burned brightly for a moment. Then the bat-like form disappeared into a cloud of smoke. The Scarecrow couldn't breathe. He yanked off his burlap sack. Before he had even had a chance to take a full gulp of air, a gloved hand reached through the smoke and grabbed him. The Scarecrow screamed. But then he felt an immediate wave of relief, and he realized it was the hand of the real Batman. Batman, alive and well. The Dark Knight examined some burned remains while keeping a tight grip on the Scarecrow. Magnesium flare, he said, only meant to blind it. But it went up like a torch. Interesting. Interesting? Cried the Scarecrow. Interesting? You just burnt up a walking corpse of yourself, and all you can say is interesting? Batman reached down and yanked the Blackfire pendant from around Scarecrow's neck. He was careful not to look directly at the jewel as he tucked it into a pouch on his belt. I know the perfect place to keep this safe. I have a collection of dangerous objects. I can't beat you even when you're dead, the Scarecrow muttered.
For the second of my scary stories on this happy Halloween, I am going to read another one of Poe's. This one is one that I had never heard of and was quite amused by. So, without further ado, Spirits of the Dead, a poem by Edgar Allan Poe. Thy soul shall find itself alone mid dark thoughts of the grey tombstone, not one of all the crowd to pry into thine hour of secrecy. Be silent in that solitude, which is not loneliness, for then the spirits of the dead who stood in life before thee are again, in death around thee, and their will shall overshadow thee. Be still. And night, though clear, shall frown, and the stars shall not look down from their high thrones in the heaven, with light like hope to mortals give, but their red orbs without beam to thy weariness shall seem, as a burning and a fever, which would cling to thee forever. Now our thoughts thou shalt not banish, now our visions ne'er to vanish, from thy spirit shall they pass, no more like dewdrops from the grass. The breeze, breath of God, is still, and the mist upon the hill, shadowy, shadowy, yet unbroken, is a symbol and a token, how it hangs upon the trees, a mystery of mysteries.
My second story comes from an anthology that I picked up a few years ago to take with me when I went to sea, because there's lots of opportunities for reading while I'm at sea. The anthology is called On a Raven's Wing, New Tales in Honor of Edgar Allan Poe. It's a collection of mystery and horror writers who wrote, I'm going to say, an assortment of different kinds of prose, but all inspired by the work of Edgar Allan Poe. Before I get to the story, here's a bit of the introduction from the editor, Stuart Kaminsky. When I sent out word that I was putting together a collection of stories to honor Poe, I gave but one condition. Poe himself or his work had to be central to the story. I expected sequels. I expected Poe as a detective. What I did not expect was what I got: a dazzling collection of contemporary terror, mystery, and literary game. The one I want to read is called The Telltale Purr by Mary Higgins Clark. There comes a time when, in the name of common decency, grandmothers ought to die. I confess that in the early stages of my life, I had a half-hearted affection for my grandmother, but that time is long since past. She is now well up into her 80s and still exceedingly vain, even though at night her teeth repose in a water glass by her bed. She has a constant struggle every morning to get her contact lenses popped into her myopic eyes and requires a cane to support her arthritic knees. The cane is a custom-made affair designed to resemble the walking stick Fred Astaire used in some of his dances. Grandma's story is that she danced with him when she was young, and the cane/walking stick is her good luck charm. Her mind is still very keen and seems to become keener even as her eccentricities grow. She, who always proudly considered herself frugal, is spending money like water. Thanks to several investments her husband, my grandfather, made, she is downright wealthy, and it has been with great pleasure that I have observed her simple lifestyle. But now it is different. For example, she just put an elevator, which cost $40,000, in her modest home. She is sure she will live to be 100 and is contemplating building a state-of-the-art gym in the backyard because she read in a Harvard medical report that exercise is good for arthritis. I submit to you that a better cure for her arthritis is to put an end to it forever. This I propose to do. You must realize that I am her sole grandson and heir, her only child. My mother departed this earth shortly after I graduated from college. In the 26 years since then, I have married and divorced twice and have been involved in many ill-fated ventures. It is time for me to stop wasting my time on useless enterprises and enjoy a life of comfort. I must help to make that possible. Obviously, her demise would need to seem natural. At her advanced age, it would not be unlikely to have her pass away in her sleep. But if someone holding a pillow were to help that situation occur, there's always the danger of a bruise that might make the police suspicious. Suspicious police look for motive, and I would be a living, breathing motive. I am uncomfortable about the fact that when under the influence of wine, I was heard to say that the only present I wanted from my grandmother for my next birthday was a ticket to her funeral. How then was I to help my grandmother sail across the river Styx without arousing suspicion? I was quite simply at a loss. I could push her down the stairs and claim she fell, but if she survived the fall, she would know that I caused it. I could try to disable her car, but that ancient old Bentley she drives with the skill of Mario Andretti would probably survive a crash. Poison is easily detectable. My problem was solved in a most unexpected way. I had been invited to have dinner at the home of a successful friend, Clifford Winkle. I value Clifford's superb wines and gourmet table far more than I value Clifford. Also, I find his wife, Belinda, insipid. But I was in the mood for a splendid dinner in comfortable circumstances and looked forward to this evening with pleasure. I was seated with Clifford and his wife, enjoying a generous scotch on the rocks that I knew had been poured from a $200 bottle of single malt reserve, when their little treasure, 10-year-old Perry, burst into the room. I've decided, he shouted, spittle spraying from the space between his upper front teeth. His parents smiled indulgently. Perry has been reading the complete works of Edgar Allan Poe this week, Clifford told me. The last time I was a guest, I had endured Perry's endless description of a book he had read about fly fishing, and how by reading it, he could really understand all about baiting and casting and catching and why fly fishing was really special. I wanted desperately to interrupt him and tell him I had already seen A River Runs Through It, Robert Redford's splendid film on the subject. But of course, I did not. Now, Perry's all-consuming passion was obviously Edgar Allan Poe. The Telltale Heart is my favorite, he crowed, his short red hair spiking up on the crown of his skull. But I could write a better ending. I know I could. Barefoot boy with cheek outpose Poe, I thought. However, I wanted to show some degree of interest. I was down to my last sip of the $200 scotch and hoped that by directing attention to myself, Clifford might notice my empty glass and not neglect his duty as my host. In high school, I wrote a new ending to The Cask of Amontillado, I volunteered. I got an A in my English class for it. I remember how it began. I cleared my throat. Yes, I killed him. I killed him a long 50 years ago. Perry ignored me. You see, in the Telltale Heart, the guy kills the old man because he can't stand looking at his eye. Then he buries the old man's heart, but when the cops come, he thinks he hears the heart beating and goes nuts and confesses. Right? Right, Clifford affirmed enthusiastically. Exactly. Mm-hmm, Belinda agreed, beaming at her whiz kid. In my book, the guy kills the old man, but another guy watches him do it, then helps him cut up the body and bury the heart under the floor. When the cops come in, the murderer laughs and jokes with them and thinks he's getting away with it. Then when the cops go, the friend comes back and as the joke says, he can hear the old man's heart beating. Isn't that good? Fascinating, I thought. If only Poe had lived to meet Perry. But then, the murderer, because he doesn't know it's a joke, believes he really is hearing the heart. And you know what? What? Clifford asked. I can't guess, Belinda gushed, her eyes wide, her hands clutching the arms of her chair. The murderer dies of fright because of the heart he thinks he's hearing. Perry beamed at his own brilliance. Send for the Nobel Prize, I thought, not realizing there was more to come. And the twist is that his friend was going to split the money the old man had hidden somewhere in London, and now he realizes he'll never know where to find it, so he's punished for the crime too. Perry grinned triumphantly, an ear-splitting grin that made all the freckles on his cheeks bond together in a henna-tinted mass. It was I who led the applause, and my reaction was genuine. The sound had scared the murderer to death. My grandmother's fear of cats rushed into my mind. She shakes and trembles to the point of almost fainting at the sound or sight of one. It goes back, I'm told, over 80 years ago to when a rabid cat attacked her in her garden. She still bears a scar on her left cheek from that long ago encounter. My grandmother has a new elevator. Suppose, just suppose, Grandma got stuck in her new elevator in the dark during a power failure. And then she hears the sounds of cats yowling and hissing and howling and purring. She hears them scratching at the door of the elevator. She is sure they will break through. She cowers, shrieking against the back of the elevator, then crumbles onto the floor, the memory of that long ago attack overwhelming her. No, it is not a memory. It is happening. She is sure that the cat is poised to attack her again. Not just one cat, but all the cats in this hydrophobic pack, foaming at the mouth, teeth bared. There is only one way to escape the panic. She is frightened into heart failure, and her death would be blamed on her being trapped, alone, at night, in the new elevator. I was so excited and thrilled at the solution to my problem that I hardly tasted the excellent dinner and was uncommonly responsive to Perry, who, of course, dined with us and never shut up. I planned my grandmother's death carefully. Nothing must arouse even the slightest suspicion. Fortunately, there are frequent power failures in her area of northern Connecticut during windstorms. She has talked of installing a home generator, but so far, that has not happened. Still, I knew I had to move swiftly. Night after night for the next few weeks, I roamed through the nearby towns, slithering through dark alleys and around abandoned buildings, any place where wild cats gathered. I tossed pieces of meat and cheese to get them fighting with one another, their teeth bared, their ungodly yowls rumbling from their throats, getting it all on tape. One night, I was attacked by a cat who, frantic for the food in my hand, sprung on me, her front claw ripping my left cheek in the same spot my grandmother was scarred. Undeterred, I kept on my mission, even recording cats in animal shelters where I caught the plaintive meows of discarded felines bewildered by their fate. At the home of a neighbor, I secretly caught on tape the contented purring of her cherished pet. A cacophony of sound, a work of genius. That was the result of my labors. As I was engaged in my nocturnal wanderings, By day, I was also lavishing attention on my grandmother, visiting her at least 3 times a week, enduring at mealtime the vegetarian regime that was her latest quirk in her battle to stay alive till her 100th birthday. Seen with such frequency, the annoying habit she was developing became increasingly hard to take. She began to avoid my eyes when I spoke to her, as though she were aware everything I said was a lie. She also took on a nervous mannerism of pursing, then releasing her lips, which gave the impression she was always sucking on a straw. Grandma lived alone. Her housekeeper, Ika, a kind Jamaican woman, arrived at 9 a.m., prepared Grandma's breakfast and lunch, tidied the house, then went home, and returned to prepare and serve dinner. Ika was very protective of Grandma. She had already confided to me her distress that Grandma might somehow get trapped in the elevator when she was alone. You know how it gets when it's very windy. She gets power failures that can last for hours, Ika worried. I assured Ika that I too was troubled by that possibility. Then I impatiently waited for the weather to cooperate and a good windstorm to come along. It finally happened. The weather report was for heavy winds during the night. That evening, I had dinner with Grandma, a particularly difficult dinner, what with the vegetarian menu, Grandma's averted eyes, her twitching mouth, and then the dismaying news that she was meeting an architect concerning her idea for building a personal gym. It was clearly time to act. After dinner, I kissed Grandma goodnight, went into the kitchen where Ika was tidying up, and drove away. At that time, I lived only 3 blocks from Grandma. I parked my car and waved to my next-door neighbor who was just arriving home. I felt it was fortuitous that, if necessary, he could testify that he had seen me enter my own modest rental cottage. I waited an hour and then slipped out my back door. It was already dark and chillingly cold, and it was easy to hurry undetected back to Grandma's house. I arrived through the wooded area, checking to be sure that Ika's car was surely gone. It was, and I slipped across the lawn to the window of the den. As I expected, I could see Grandma, hunched up on her recliner, an old fur lap robe wrapped around her, watching her favorite television show. For the next 10 minutes, she stayed there. Then, as I had expected, promptly at 9 o'clock, the fur robe dragging behind her, she turned off the television and made her way to the front of the house. In a flash, key in hand, I was at the basement door and inside. As soon as I heard the rumble of the elevator, I threw the switch, plunging the house into silence and darkness. I crept upstairs, my feet noiseless in my sneakers, my flashlight a thin beam. From the sound of my grandmother's cries for help, I could detect that the elevator was only a few feet off the floor. Now, for the tricky part. I placed my tape recorder on the vestibule table behind a book I had left for Grandma. I reasoned that Ika, if indeed she noticed it, would think nothing of it being there. I had developed the habit of bringing books and little gifts for Grandma. And then I turned on the tape. The sound that thundered from it was a litany from cat hell, meowing, clawing, scratching, and howling, their shrieks interwoven with a sudden, incongruous rattle of purring contentment. There was absolute silence from the elevator. Had the recording done its job already, I wondered? It was possible, but I wouldn't know for sure until the morning. The tape was 20 minutes long and would play repeatedly until midnight. I was sure that would be sufficient. I let myself out of the house and walked home at a quick pace, bracing against the sharp wind that was now making tree branches bend and dance. Chilled to the bone, I went directly to bed. I confess, I could not fall asleep. The mental image of my grandmother's stiffening body inside her elevator kept me from a restful slumber. But then, as I allowed myself to imagine finally getting my hands on all her money, my frame of mind improved, and from dawn till 8 o'clock, I enjoyed a refreshing slumber. But then as I began to prepare breakfast, several possibilities occurred to me. Suppose Grandma's face was frozen in a frightened mask. Would that make anyone suspicious? Worse yet, suppose for some reason the recording had not automatically turned off. My original plan had been to await Ika's phone call, the one that would convey the sad news that Grandma had been trapped in the elevator and must have had a heart attack. At the frightening possibility that the tape just might still be playing, I leaped up from the breakfast table, threw on some clothes, and rushed over, arriving as Ika was opening the front door. To my vast relief, there was no sound from the recorder. The morning was overcast, which meant that the vestibule was dark. As Ika greeted me, she tried to turn on the light. Then she frowned. My God, there must have been another power failure. She turned and made a beeline for the stairs to Grandma's bedroom. I, on the other hand, raced down to the basement and threw the master switch on the panel. The whir of the elevator rewarded me. I rushed up the stairs and was there when Ika yanked open the elevator door. Grandma was on the floor, wrapped up in her mink lap robe. She opened her eyes and blinked up at us. With the fur wrapped around her head, the strands of fur resting on her cheek, for all the world, she had the face of a cat. Her mouth pursed in and out as though she were sipping milk. Grandma! My voice failed. With Ika's help, she was struggling to her feet, her hands on the floor, her back arched to help regain her balance. She sighed. Or was she saying, purr, purr, that's the best sleep I've had in years, Grandma said contentedly. Weren't you frightened trapped in there? Ika asked incredulously. Oh no, I was tired and I just made the best of it. I tried calling out, but there was no one to hear me. I decided not to waste my voice. The record had been playing. I had heard it myself. Grandma was eyeing me. You look terrible, she said. I don't want you worrying about me. Don't you know I'll live to be 100? That's my promise to you. So I was stuck in the elevator. The carpet is thick. I lay down and was nice and warm under my robe. In my dreams, I was hearing this faint purring sound, like water lapping against the shore. Afraid I would give myself away, I stumbled downstairs and grabbed my recorder from the table. Then realized that in my haste, I had knocked a small object off the table. I bent down and picked it up. It was a hearing aid. I started to lay it down and saw there was another one on the table. Ika was coming down the stairs. How long has Grandma been wearing hearing aids? I demanded. They're just what I'm coming for. She leaves them on that table every night. She's so vain that I guess she didn't tell you that her hearing has been going steadily downhill and she's practically deaf now. She's been studying lip reading and is quite good at it. Haven't you noticed the way she always looks at your lips when you're talking? She finally got the hearing aids, but uses them only for television in the evening and always leaves them right there. She can't hear? I asked, dumbfounded. Only a few sounds. Deep ones. Nothing shrill. That happened 5 years ago. Of course, I immediately destroy the tape, but in my sleep, I hear it playing over and over. It doesn't frighten me. Instead, it keeps me company. I don't know why. There's something else that's a little strange. I cannot look at my grandmother's face without seeing the face of a cat. That's because of those little whiskers on her cheeks and lips, the odd pursing movement of her mouth, the narrow, intense eyes that are always focused on my lips. Also, her bedchamber of choice is now the elevator, where, for naps and at night, she curls up on a carpeted floor, wrapped in her mink lap robe. Her breathing has even taken on a purring sound. I can hardly keep my wits about me as I await my inheritance. I do not have the courage to try to precipitate its arrival again. I live with Grandma now, and as time passes, I believe I am beginning to resemble her. The scar on her cheek is directly under her left eye. Mine is in the same spot. I have a very light beard and shave infrequently. At times, my beard looks just like her whiskers. We have those same narrow green eyes. My grandmother loves very warm milk. She's taken to pouring it into a saucer to cool before she laps it up. I tried it, and now I like it that way too. It's perfect.
Well, we want to thank everybody for listening to our annual Campfire Stories. This is one of the favorite things that we do. We love doing this every year. I don't know why we ever didn't do this, but it's one of the best things that we do.
Absolutely. I can't think of a better way to spend Halloween than sharing some of our favorite spooky stories and just getting not only us, but you all into the mood as well. So thank you for spending the time with us. Once again, if you would like to hear more, definitely go check out our other Campfire Stories, episodes 1, 2, and 3 that you can find released on Halloween over the last 3 years. To find out more about the Haunting You podcast, go check out our social media at Haunting You on YouTube, at Haunting University on Instagram, and Facebook.com/HauntingU, just the letter U. That is where you will find everything that we are in the process of. And we are so excited to get back with you in November and talk about how the haunt season went.
All right. Thank you all for listening. We appreciate it.
Be nice to black cats. And happy haunting.
Bye, everybody. We are incredibly grateful to all the sponsors who make this show possible, especially our premium sponsors, the Chamber of Haunters and VFX. You can learn more about our premium sponsors by checking out their websites at chamberofhaunters.com and vfxcreates.com. Check out our website at hauntingyou.com for more information on everything that we do. Haunting You can be reached via Facebook at facebook.com/hauntingyou with just the letter U, or on Instagram under the handle at Haunting University, and YouTube under the handle at Haunting You. Haunting You is a production of Sanguine Creek Entertainment. All audio clips and sound effects are used under a Creative Commons Attribution or Public Domain license from Purple Planet Music at purple-planet.com or the Sound Bible at soundbible.com. Please see the show notes for more information on all the clips used in this episode.